To my immediate left is Mohamed Rajmohamed, who, like me, also works at Cedar Crest College. He's an adjunct professor of religious studies. He teaches a course which is heavily attended on Islam in America and has very broad research interests, including postmodernism, Shiism, and Sufism. He's a frequent presenter. I'm sure some of you have seen him before at the colleges and universities in the Lehigh Valley. He's also a member of the Board of Trustees of the Al-Ahad Islamic Center in Allentown. He speaks Gujarati, Swahili, and Hindi. Mohamed has expertise in discussions about religious pluralism and also helped years ago form an interfaith council in the Lehigh Valley. He has presented twice at a conference on culture, including this one on caregiving run by Phoebe Ministries. And then on the end is Shree Patel. Shree was born in northeastern part of the United States. He is a graduate of Temple University, and he worked in London for years in international finance. He's employed by Morgan Stanley in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and has over 2 years of experience there as a financial advisor. Shree is registered as an investment advisory representative. Just this last January, in January of 2014, Shree was initiated into the monastic order of the Hindu Swaminarayan tradition and serves at the Anoopam mission, which is on Clearview Road in Copley. He traveled to India for the initiation from his guru, and he serves the temple in this capacity. He frequently hosts students from colleges in the Lehigh Valley and serves a very important role in community relations for the temple. And I have to tell you, as a footnote to that, he is always honoring my requests, sometimes, unfortunately, with too short notice, to bring classes up to the Anoopam mission, which I greatly appreciate. So we're very lucky to have both of these presenters with us, and I guess we'll start with Mohamed. Would you like to make a statement?
I'd like to begin by thanking Phoebe Ministries and the wonderful job they've done, and all the people who worked behind the scenes, and those are here as volunteers as well too, and to my colleague Alan as well too, and my good friend as well too. Didn't mistake that. Let me begin with a precept that is usually used in Islam when dealing with relationships with elderly. The relationship in Islam always form relations with God first and foremost. That translates into a relationship with the elderly. And as a footnote to that, not to the footnote, but as where is it that comes from? The Quran, which is a foundational text in Islam, forms the basis of how relationships are kept between people. And I'll read to you two verses from the Quran that are about relationship to parents, and especially elderly. And your Lord has decreed that you not worship except him, and to parents good treatment. Whether or not both of them reach old while you, with you, say not to them much as oof. In Arabic, oof is the word of irreverence, is the word I use it. And do not repel them, but speak to them a noble word, and lower to them the wing of humility, meaning to speak to them out of gentleness and courtesy, and say, my Lord, have mercy upon them as they brought me up when I was younger. Second verse, and we have enjoined upon man care for his parents. His mother carried him, increasing her in weakness upon weakness, and is weaning into 2 years. Be grateful to me, meaning the Lord, and to your parents, and to me is the final destination. With this in mind, I'll make a bit of an attempt to define what old age means in Islam in this particular context. Old age is not simply the physical frailty that one goes through. Old age is also the unfolding of the spirit within the human soul that leads them through maturity, not physical maturity, but also the spiritual maturity. Because in reverence, when a Muslim addresses an older person, he calls him murabbi, meaning one who has nurtured him. And the place of an older person in society, and I'm speaking in abstract here, is like that of a prophet in a community. That's how much a value of an older person is. So with that in mind, let me get to the specifics of aging in America among Muslim population. The Muslim population in America is about 1% of the total population, the American population. And of that, about 5.25% is over 55. And of that, about 40% are immigrant Muslims who are first, second generation into third generations now. And given the fact that these immigrants are socialized, by that I mean grow up in communities, they were nurtured with values that they were from the countries of origin, caring for the elderly is an obligation to them. And therefore, the notion of putting an elderly person in a nursing home is forbidden, is literally seen as a stigma. Not only that, but when a person is put as a last resort, when they cannot be taken care of in a home, it is always done with a great deal of, shall I say, hesitation at the least. But there is also how it is that the elderly are taken care of in a Muslim community in America. Most mosques have social activities for the elderly. They have elderly groups that are taken care of. They take them to trips and so forth. But also the spiritual part of it too. That there are services in which the elderly are actually lead the community in doing so, given that they have a special status in the community. More importantly, how is it that the reverence that's given to an elderly person is done in Islam? In that the place of the older person is always like that of an imam, meaning a person who leads the community, very much so. But how do we deal with that physical reality of that here in America, in a country which is decidedly secular? There is a notion called sandwich generation. By this I mean a generation that is caught between taking care of young children and the elderly at the same time, and the frustration that comes with it. And there are reports, and one has to be realistic here, of abuse of elderly, meaning verbal abuse. And also how is it that the hidden illness among American Muslims is mental illness. And the stigma that is placed upon trying to reveal that to somebody in a community is always seen as being very problematic. So how is it taken care of? The extended family among American Muslims always takes good part in taking care of the elderly. I'm going through that right now. My brother, who is well in his 80s right now, is ill, and his extended family, myself included, take care of him as much as we can, rather than putting him in a facility that's taken care of by others. In addition to that, mosques have support systems for the elderly, that they regularly come to visit the elderly and take care of them. But more importantly, it is the relationship that they have with him that engenders a spiritual relationship as well too. And here I want to talk briefly about spiritual relationships. The spiritual relationships in Islam are always seen as relationships that are formed from your piety, more importantly. Inculcating piety, how piety affects health. That means how is it that that person is going to be able to facing suffering or end-of-life decisions. Two ways of looking at it. One is that it is seen as a test from God, where God becomes an active partner, if you will, in that person's life in dealing with how it is going to rationalize what has happened to him. Secondly, it is seen as a way, at least in one understanding, that it is expiation of one's own sin, leading him towards a greater placement in the hereafter, which will be better than the one here as well, too. And in conclusion, all I'll say is that there are places within the United States that have good support system as in nursing homes. However, very few Muslims actually put in nursing homes because of the support system that is given by both communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Shree.
Well, hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Phoebe Ministries for organizing this forum, which is a wonderful opportunity for us to have this type of dialogue. Also like to commend all of you for seeking to broaden your minds and understand our different faiths to better care for those that are in your charge. So I know that's not an easy thing and not something that everyone does, and I think that's a very commendable thing. I always find it a little difficult in forums such as this, in a short amount of time, to give a Hindu perspective on issues without kind of giving a proper background about it, what Hindu philosophy is, to put things into context, because there's really not a lot of knowledge out there sometimes about what our philosophy is. But this isn't the time or place to go into tremendous depth. But I would encourage you If you are interested to learn more about our faith, you're more than welcome to visit our temple, which is in North Whitehall anytime. I live there, and I host groups or individuals that come at any time to learn more about our faith, and I'd be more than happy to do that. But for today's purposes, I'd have to, I'll go over a few points, but some of which I'll echo what my colleague, Mr. Mohamed here, said. There are some similarities. One is the tremendous respect in our culture for elders. And that extends to the fact that we consider, Hindus look at things differently from the Western mindset. I've found that the Western mindset revolves around rights, us defining what our rights are and defending what our rights are. A Hindu kind of approaches things from a little different standpoint. We place a tremendous amount of emphasis on duty. What is our duty to ourselves? What's our duty to our family? What's our duty to society? What's our duty to God? And that kind of defines how we live our lives. And one of those foremost duties is taking care of our parents and our elderly generation. So for us too, there's a stigma with putting one's elders into a nursing home. In my own personal case, my father suffered a lot later in life before he passed away a few years ago. And he was in and out of the hospital repeatedly. He would spend months and months in the hospital. But not for a second did I think about putting him in a nursing home, even though sometimes that was a recommendation, but I just couldn't do it. And I think a lot of people share that mentality. That being said, I think that as Mohamed said, that living in this day and age, in this society, it does have an influence on our culture. And things are changing, and you're starting to see some dilution of that as time goes by. So there are some people being placed in long-term care facilities. But what you are finding are specific communities that are coming up, adult care and elderly care communities that are being formed that are specific for our faith, for people of our faith, specifically because they can cater a little bit more towards their needs. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Like, for example, our dietary needs. Hindus are predominantly vegetarians. Because we believe in nonviolence and not taking life to sustain our own if we can help it. And a lot of us are very strict vegetarians, so we don't, besides not eating fish, meat, or poultry, we actually don't even consume eggs. So as you can imagine, that can cause some issues. Also, when it comes to let me talk a little bit about kind of the Hindu mindset, and I think you'll get a little bit an idea of some of the other concepts that are important to us. Like the other world's faith traditions, Hindus believe that this body is temporary, but the soul is eternal. What differentiates us is that we believe in reincarnation, which we believe that the soul is on this journey, taking body after body to get closer to God until we achieve a state of being where we can achieve unity with God and not have to keep taking physical birth. Now that has some pretty profound implications. You'll find that your typical Hindu kind of has kind of a broader view of their life than just this one limited existence. A lot of our rites and rituals, for example, when it comes to end of life, are really associated with learning to prepare for the next life that one's going to undergo. Kind of wrapping up in this life those attachments and connections that you have, and preparing yourselves mentally, physically, and emotionally, and spiritually for the continuation of that journey in the afterlife. And so, so that kind of affects a Hindu's mindset when it comes to end of life and aging issues. Another thing is that Hindus tend to be very introspective. Our path to spirituality tends to be more centered, inwardly focused and less outwardly focused. So as one progresses spiritually and as one ages, historically in Hindu thought and Hindu life, people would start, as they got older, disengaging from the world more and more in terms of their worldly responsibilities, their worldly focus. Once they've fulfilled their duties and responsibilities to their family, raising their children, educating their children, having them married off, and so on, they historically would start disengaging more and more and turning more towards spirituality. And so that's an important thing to understand in terms of your typical Hindu's mindset. Now, like all of the rest of the world's religions, a lot of what I'm saying today from a Hindu perspective depends on how pious someone is, how much of an observant Hindu they are. I can only kind of talk more from the standpoint of what our philosophy is, but you'll find a range of ways that people practice or the intensity by which they feel some of these things. The other thing that's important to understand from a Hindu's perspective is that for us, because we believe in reincarnation, we believe that this is just one step in a long, much longer journey towards ultimately reaching God. We actually don't really separate religious or spiritual life from our worldly life as much as some other cultures do. We believe that all of our actions that we do on a daily basis impacts our soul's journey. And the very purpose of existence for us is to advance our soul. So you'll find us in general to be very spiritual people, really focused on living a righteous life, living a pure life. Because in order to advance ourselves spiritually, we believe that there's a strong connection between body, mind, and soul. And therefore, this leads to a lot of spiritual practices that Hindus imbibe in their daily life. For example, there's a lot of fasting that takes place in our religion, undergoing physical austerities as a method by which to connect to God. Hinduism is a very broad, vast, and ancient religion. There are many different paths within Hinduism, so you're going to find that there are not a lot of standard practices when it comes to such things as fasting. People will fast on different days of the week for different lengths and durations. They'll eat certain things and they won't eat other things. It really depends on the sub-faith that they're from within Hinduism. Another thing that, to echo Mohammed's point, is that Hindus will often look at their body and what they're undergoing in terms of illness and associate it with a spiritual cause. We will often think that it is a testing from God, or it is paying back karma, for example. And I'll get to karma in a minute, but that can be a bit of a challenge when dealing with a Hindu, because they place much more emphasis on the spiritual world than the physical world, and because they kind of have this attitude that whatever is happening is God's will, and whatever I'm enduring physically is because of His will, they tend to be sometimes disregardful of their bodies and what they're going through, and not as attentive to it as they maybe should be. This is, like, I know my religious leader kind of discourages this. He says that the body is a temple, that the body is an important, actually the most valuable possession we've been given by God, a real gift by God to do His work, to get closer to Him, and that we should take care of our bodies. But I think sometimes that message gets lost. But I'm just making you aware of this so that you can kind of understand that sometimes you're going to face this mindset. I was saying a little bit, I did want to mention something about karma, because it is misunderstood many times, and I don't know if any of us have a full grasp of it, because it is a pretty complicated concept. But you know, karma could be thought of as simply as what goes around comes around. And there are other explanations for it, but basically from a Hindu perspective, we believe that whatever is happening to me today is a function of what I've done in the past, either earlier in this lifetime or a previous lifetime. So I don't have a lot of control over what's going on. It's been predetermined. But that being said, we're taught that we can affect the future by how we react to our reality today. And we can create good or bad karma going forward based on if we do positive, constructive actions today in the light of whatever we're going through, or negative actions. So that's why there's a great deal of emphasis on positive, constructive, righteous living in our belief system. One other thing I want to mention, just from a dietary standpoint, Hindus and Indians have been known for high incidences of heart disease and diabetes. And you know, I've heard a lot of explanations for it. The thing that makes the most sense to me, I don't know if I have a lot of scientific, I haven't done a lot of scientific research into this, but it kind of makes sense to me, which is that we come from an agricultural society, historically in India, and our diet was based towards a lot of, like, we would consume a lot of oil, a lot of sugar, fried foods, and so on and so forth, but we would burn it off because we were doing a lot of physical work in the past. I know some of my contemporaries, when I talk to them and hear about what they used to eat, it just boggles the mind. But now in this day and age, not many people are working like that hard physical labor, but the diet hasn't changed that much. You know, what we eat as a culture, it hasn't changed that much. So I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing huge incidences of diabetes and heart disease. And then lastly, I know I've taken up a fair amount of time, but lastly I would just say that the other thing that's really important, and I think other Eastern cultures share this, is the importance of family in our culture. For us, we're very much tied to our family. Our well-being's tied to our family. Our support system really comes from family, and you know, also faith, but very much family. So you're going to find that that the family connections of the people that you deal with and you work with will be a very important component of providing care for them, and to whatever extent you can encourage that, support that, I think you will help in the caregiving of those individuals. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to make a couple of points and then see if either one of you has some comments about that, and then open it up to you after that. One of the first things I want to say is just a cultural observation. I assume you are probably aware that there are many places in the world where Hindus and Muslims are not getting along well and have not historically. It's fascinating when you see the amount of commonality that has come out of these two presentations when that history is not present here. And that's one of the things that you can say about the new face, diversified face of religion in America. It may offer some chances that we haven't seen historically and globally for religions to begin communicating with each other. But here's the observation I wanted to probe with you. There is a stereotype about religion in the West, that religion is belief. You hear it all the time. And there's another way of looking at it. To me, James Carse, who taught religious studies at NYU for years before he retired, said it the best in a book that came out a few years ago. He labels belief as a form of ignorance, and he said there's three types. The first is ordinary ignorance. That's kind of like, where did I put my house keys today? That's the kind of thing we all run into every day. The second is what he calls willful ignorance. That means I know this to be true, and therefore what you know to be true isn't. Now, he suggests that religion in America tends to model this second category. The truth is here, so it's not here. But he says there's a third kind of ignorance that he calls higher ignorance. That's ignorance based on mystery. It's ignorance that the metaphor is looking up at the Milky Way on a summer's night, and realizing what's just been found as of last week in terms of scientific discoveries, and that's the possibility of not only this universe, but multiple universes. A level of transcendence that you can't think about or contain. So my question is, can either one of you talk to the notion of spirituality and aging from this point of view of higher ignorance, rather than just as belief? Any thoughts?
I think spirituality is not simply, I think what was defined in the previous session was something horizontal that is an agreement of how people deal with each other. Spirituality in the higher sense of ignorance, as Carr says it, is the notion of connecting to that which is transcendent, which is greater than ourselves, but not in an abstract sense, but in an experiential way, which is very important. That aging is not simply, that's why I said aging is unfolding of the soul into the spirit, where there's integration to some degree of how one begins to see the world as a little boy with that great sense of wonder about it, which is truly amazing. That spirituality is the one that eventually helps give that dimension of reverence that is given to the elderly in Islam. So spirituality is not simply that abstract, prosaic thing. It is an experiential notion of how one sees the world in an aged way, which is truly beautiful.
Thank you. Shree?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that our scriptures and our philosophy teach us that this physical world is very limited, that the spiritual world is much broader and vaster than this. I remember a great saint wrote it as, like, if you looked at it kind of as a hot air balloon, as the physical world being the gondola and the spiritual world being the balloon itself, that the physical world is dwarfed by the spiritual world. So there's so much more going on that's beyond this physical world. And like Mohamed said, a lot of it that knowledge can only be gained through experience. And that's where those that are older than us, wiser than us, have gone through that experience can be a great source for us in terms of tapping into that and sharing that with us. So I think you wrapped it up really well.
Thank you both. It's really an important idea. I mean, the metaphor is more sitting in the light of the divine than it is trying to provide an overlay of meaning, I think. And aging does connect with that, and it's a very important perspective on aging. And then I think just one other much more pragmatic question, since I know you both have Gujarati ethnicity in your own family traditions. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the role of the extended family in caregiving and some of the incredible networking that really goes on. Any initial thoughts about that?
Yes. When you go to India and you visit where we're from, you find that people have lived for generations, not only in the same villages, but in the same houses. And that even when they married, they would marry amongst a certain region or area. So everybody knows everyone. Everyone's connected to one another. And extended families really were a wonderful support network in terms of looking after one another. They had just a wonderful way of, if somebody suffered loss in the family, for others to fill in the gap. And leaning on one another. And yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary when, like, you can just literally get a handful of Gujaratis together and they'll just start making connections by talking to one another. Once they find out where they're from and who they're related to, they'll just find some kind of connection, and it's incredible. So it just shows you how tightly woven the society is amongst Gujaratis in particular that I've experienced.
There's a word that I've not heard here today, and I was late getting here, is the word empathy. And how is empathy engendered? How is empathy actually cultivated? And we forget that the role of religious virtues, the virtues of recognizing an elder, is empathy. That empathy comes from recognizing that person has something of the spark of the divine within them that's shining greater than a younger person does. And that makes the connection even greater. So with this extended family, or even beyond that, the network at the mosque or the temple, this is what really brings people together.
If you don't mind a personal example, we've known each other for a long time. This guy showed up one day at Cedar Crest College getting ready to teach, and his radiator was boiling over in his car. And if they remember that, if that's ever happened to any of you, you know you panic. I mean, who do you call? Well, the panic I saw in you lasted about 3.5 minutes until you figured out who within your network you could call. And as I remember, the guy came and got your car and then took you to lunch.
That's right.
Yeah. It's a good example. Networking is just incredible. And so many of us in America outside of extended families don't know that, which is why I asked. It's a strong factor that we all really can learn from, and especially in terms of caregiving. Do you have some questions? Yes. Hope you didn't mind that.
I'm just curious, with relocating to America, and we as Americans have changed our families. We move away from where we were born. So with your emphasis on family, and when you're here, do you have that strong network? Or for people coming over, how do they grow that network? Is there something in place?
It's an interesting question as to how is it that the second generation actually internalizes a lot of quote-unquote American, and how does one define American? That's an open-ended question. I won't get into that. But it's noteworthy that the ties that form with each other are not simply familial ties. They go beyond the familial ties. They go to the mosque network or the social network as well that really brings people together.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like my father came here, he was the first of the family to emigrate here, and I was born and raised here. But when he came, he was the first, and then he brought his 4 brothers and his 4 sisters here one by one. They lived with him, they got settled here, and then they all had their families, and we were very interconnected. But yes, I would agree that like being born and raised in this country, that for my generation, it's a little bit more of a challenge. I was fortunate because I saw all of this in action. My relatives coming and staying with us for a while. But for this next generation, they don't have, and they're more widespread, so it's a little bit more difficult. I would say some of the strongest bonds that I've found, like Mohamed said, is through the temple now. People coming there, it feels like a second family to me, because we worship together, we rely on one another. So I think in some ways it's almost kind of filling the void, or providing reinforcement, whatever way you want to put it, but of leveraging those connections and making them stronger. But I think, personally speaking, I think that it's really going to be the faith traditions that are going to keep these values going. I think on a family-by-family basis, it's a little bit more difficult to do, especially as everyone's become so dispersed. But I think that more and more it's going to be kind of that.
Just want to add one quick comment, sorry to interrupt you, is that there's a notion of third space in America, that the first space is for most of us is home. The second space is either work or school. The third space for the younger generation is probably the mall. But the third space for immigrant communities is always the mosque or the temple. Yeah. It really makes a big difference.
Good point. Yes.
We had Japanese exchange students in our house for a long time, and they talked a lot about the difference between America and their land was that the focus was always the group, and whereas America, it's always the individual. And I just wonder if that is an Eastern thing in general, or is that just specific, do you think, to the Japanese? Would you comment on that?
I mean, I do think that there is a stronger emphasis in the Eastern cultures on family, on community, on society, and how we're all interconnected. I do, having been raised in this country and trying to assimilate both cultures and the values of both, that's always been a bit of a struggle for me. I do find that the American culture is a lot more individualistic and sometimes clashes with that mentality we have. So I do think that there is a difference. I don't know, I think in the Japanese culture, from what I've observed, it seems like it's maybe a little bit more pronounced than it is for us, but there are a lot of similarities.
The notion of what constitutes honor among families is always through group interaction, never by oneself. And that, in a nutshell, just sums up what you're asking. How is it that one protects one other? How is it that one stands up for one's brother? How is it that one stands up in case of crisis? My own case right now, where my brother is ailing, all of us are there for him. And there's never a time where he's alone in his house with his wife. So that's honor. And how is that he values that, how that translates to the younger generation that well, as I say, Muslims say, inshallah, God willing, we'll carry on the next generation as well, too.
So it would bring dishonor to the family if you did not do that?
I think so, and the notion of stigma is closely associated with that. Why is it that Muslim Americans or American Muslims do not put elderly in nursing homes is one of the reasons of the stigma associated with discarding, literally discarding somebody outside of the family bond.
Yes.
Thanks. Mohamed, I wanted to ask you a little bit more. I appreciate that you were willing to sort of talk about a little bit sometimes of the challenges of the elderly or aging in place in the home and that sandwich generation and how the extended family and the mosque community can become a support system in those situations. I'm just wondering, in terms of psychosocial support, how would you, speaking from your experience, the Arab American community reaching out for psychosocial support in counseling situations, or people coming into the community, or that expertise is within the community and therefore able to provide that support?
That's a very good question. Thank you. There is a couple of chaplaincy training programs currently for Muslim chaplains who are taught how to lend that kind of support to communities. And one of the ways in which that's done is to read out with the ailing person prayers to make them understand why is it that they're going through what they're going through, and not to be simply diffident and say give up. And more importantly, it's also how is it that is conveyed to that person. And the fact that the role of the imam in a community lends legitimacy to that particular voice makes it makes it more efficacious, I should say, in conveying that particular support system to that.
Thank you. Yes. Making you work. My work.
Thank you. I have two questions, and one is, I'm a little bit like the ladies' questions here, but how do you handle rehabilitation if someone needs physical therapy? Do you do that at home for the elderly?
Yes. I mean, I'm seeing like we have a few people, even one of our sadhus or monks at the temple right now is doing rehab. He had fallen on ice and he'd had suffered a fracture, and there are nurses that come and work with him, a physical therapist that comes to the temple and works with him. So, but he was he was at Fellowship Manor for a while in terms of getting care there as well. So, yeah, for us, we don't have any limitations on getting physical therapy, either off-site or on-site.
So you would send someone
Yeah,
to a
we
nursing
would.
home for
Yeah,
rehab?
yeah.
Would you, sir?
And the same thing as well, too. But there are provisions, however, that the question of meals or even ritual purity for Muslims is an important one, because you need to be in a state of ritual purity, say your prayers, that be observed. And the fact that sometimes there are gender issues, that the female would like to have a female therapist rather than a male therapist. So those issues will have to be worked out. But if it cannot be, then she'll have to accept it, just like going to a male gynecologist opposed to a female one. You know, it's a matter of choice, so that comes down to it.
Just to reinforce that, when it comes to meals, for example, Family members usually go and take it. Like when my father was in hospital every day, we would just take food for him so that he would have food that he could eat.
And my other question is just about your name. You have the same first name, same last name? Is that cultural? How does that work?
No, it's just so happened that there was.
Just happened like that?
It just happened to be that way.
Okay, thank you.
Is there a hand back there somewhere? Yes.
I hope this isn't disrespectful, but in terms of both of your religions, because I primarily work in end-of-life care, and because of how I've listened to how you perceive and reincarnation and things like that, how do both of you approach, or how would your religion approach in terms of symptom management, the things that come up in end-of-life, and the caregiving aspect? Because my experience has been, in terms of familial, that you're very good, both religions, that you care greatly and take excellent care of your family members. But as a nurse, I want to be able to be respectful into help that I can provide, you know, with my experience and expertise, but I don't want to overstep. Do you know what I mean?
When it comes to end-of-life issues, I mean, I've found that there's a lot of emphasis on prayer. So you'll often find them engaged more in prayer. There's a lot of emphasis on tying up, you know, your relationships with your family, like, so just being able to move on from that. So spending time with family, and just talking about things like that. We don't have any restrictions from a medical standpoint of making someone as comfortable as possible at the end of their life. There's a lot of discretion basically given to the family to make whatever choices they need to make. I haven't found a lot of hard and fast rules about, you know, what course of action they need to take when it comes to like hospice care and how they want to typically manage that very end process. But outside of that, I mean, I can't think of anything that comes to mind specifically that where I would feel that you would kind of be breaching protocol and so on. I think they're not. One thing that you find with the way we approach things is that we don't have a lot of hard and fast rules when it comes to that.
The simple principle is to do no harm, first and foremost, is the fact that if they're going to make that life much more intolerable for the alien person or not, and the fact that if it does, this becomes a legal issue, because Islam, like Judaism, is a legal-based religion. And how is it that some things can and cannot be done, whether it's, let's say, end-of-life issues, give an example, where you want to make the person as comfortable as possible before they reach the terminal point. And also, if it's a question of a ventilator, a person on a ventilator, who has the right to take that off or not becomes a legal issue. And usually it's the eldest person in the family who makes the decision based upon the ruling given by a jurist as to how to handle that. So that's what it comes down to. But the basic principle, do no harm, that's what it really comes down to.
Good questions. Let me, well, there's a lull, ask one more. I teach a course on spirituality and wellness at Cedar Crest College, and as part of that I use a film which I would highly recommend to you. It's called Fierce Grace, and it's about Ram Dass. You may remember, I can say this to an older crowd, not to a group of 18-year-olds, but some of you will remember Ram Dass, who was born in the Jewish community in Connecticut, I believe, and became initiated in a Hindu tradition, became a strong part of the countercultural movement during the Vietnam War. This film looks at him recently as he's had a stroke, and he talks about this as having been stroked, fierce grace. And the question that comes out of it, I'd like to get your responses, both of you, on it, and that's the issue of wellness and illness. Can you be ill and still have wellness?
As I said in my brief presentation is that illness is seen as a from God, coming from God, and the fact that that illness is a means of reaching God first and foremost. That God becomes an active partner. How is it through that experience of that illness? How does one get closer to make meaning out of what has happened to that particular person? So there is that notion of fierce grace in Islam, in the fact that this is a gift. This is not a malady of any kind. That's what it comes down to.
I was just reminded, there was basically kind of my counterpart where I left my career and I joined the temple 10 years ago and just volunteered and like lived my life at the temple and just kind of started walking this path towards monkhood. I have a counterpart who's female, and she did the same thing. She lives in London and just totally has dedicated her life to serving the community and serving the temple. And she went through a very bad illness a couple years ago. And I talked to my guru about that. I was saying that, you know, I'm really struggling with this because she's done so much, she's sacrificed so much, and she's suffering so much. And he said something that really kind of changed my whole perspective on things. He said, yes, she's enduring this illness, but remember, it's not touching her soul. And as soon as he said that, it really, it really kind of changed the perspective for me, and I thought a lot about it after that. I think from a Hindu perspective, you know, and he's even used these words to me, like when somebody's gotten ill. He says the body is going to do what the body is going to do, but that we need to look at it from a spiritual standpoint. What is my soul's journey, and how do I advance my soul through this? And from a Hindu perspective, we're taught to try as much as possible to rely on God, God's strength, to connect to God, to try to take as much as possible a positive, proactive approach, constructive approach to dealing with a difficult situation. And that will lead to positive, constructive outcomes in the future. Maybe even if it's not physically, it'll lead to positive, constructive outcomes for our soul.
An illness as an enemy. Yeah, yeah. Are there? Yes.
Comment on the fact that I think there are different movements alive in the society. I was born in Sweden, and now I'm de facto the senior Swede or Scandinavian elder in my community. And while we represent several different religious lines, where we seem to come together is on the cultural, so that we share very much the same value that, and I think within agrarian societies and within even the, like the Dutch-German, we, for instance, at end of life, it's important to us to be able to take grandma or the aunt and to wash them, to do the final washing. Not have the nurse do it in the hospital. No, that's something that's important for we, the family members, to do. And I know I was sitting next to a Muslim, and it was his job in the mosque to have he called it a privilege, to be able to bathe his brother. And I would presume that in the Hindu tradition, because we all use water in a washing, that there are certain things that now some of us are reclaiming. We're not letting the undertaker take care of everything. It's up to us as the family, as the community. And maybe that's happening in other places. I am noticing, too, that a number of the younger Scandinavians, you know, are looking to me for how do we do this now? You know, how do we have the smorgasbord? You know, what is the traditional 7-course meal? You know, but then when it comes to other things like, well, now how do we take care of bestemor, bestefar? But that whole sense of they want to learn about honoring the elders, but it's a real question, and I'm looking at that in various places, and I found that in our church community, they are starting to reclaim that. which I think is hopeful.
Any thoughts?
As far as the ritual bathing of a dead person in Islam, it's always done by a committee at the mosque who do that. A male washes the male, a female the female. But what is important during that washing, the 3 washes done. The first wash is simply to use the gentlest of soap and shampoo. And the second wash is done with camphor water. And the second wash is done with berry water or perfume. And the third one is camphor to mask any smells. But what is important during that process of washing the body, which is done with the head first and then the right side and the left side, is that there's no mundane talk about yesterday's football game. It's always chanting the prayers at all times, because the principle behind is that the consciousness survives death, which is a starkly different notion compared to other traditions. The consciousness always survives death, that the deceased person is able to feel and hear things greater than they did when they did in life.
Yes, we believe that as well. For us, this body is just a temporary vessel, and once life leaves it, for us it's kind of dust to dust, ashes to ashes. So we actually cremate our bodies in order to return this to the ecosystem so it can create life again and be a vessel for another soul. So we don't tie a tremendous amount of importance to the body after we die. That being said, we do have a lot of rituals associated with a dead body. Religious rituals that are twofold. One is to, because the consciousness does survive death, to ensure a clean separation of the soul from this body so it can continue its journey. So there's some rituals that are associated with that and prayers that are associated with that. But then the other thing is to make sure that the body is properly, there's part of the funeral process where we're honoring that life, and so the rituals that are associated with that. But then there are some practical aspects to it as well to prepare the body for that cremation process, and that's usually done at the direction of a Hindu priest, but the family is very much engaged in that and assists in that.
Just a comment. What you mentioned resonates with me also. I remember when my father died and was cremated, we were burying the cremains in a very small cemetery in northern New Jersey, and we met the director of the cemetery who had dug the hole for the jar full of cremains, and he said, listen, if you want to, there's the pile of dirt, and there's a shovel behind the tree if you would like to bury it and close the grave, which was a wonderful experience, just wonderful, and it really resonate with what you said. Thank you. Other comments, questions from anybody? Going once? Going twice? Yes.
The younger generation, I know that the older generation is pretty strong with, the cohesive, but how about the younger generation? The ones that are here, born here, and maybe about 20 years old now? What does that look like for?
The institution of the mosque is an important one. It's not simply a place where you go to pray, we also pray a place where you go to learn. And among the things that are taught is, on a practical level, is not simply how to say your prayers, to honor the elders, to retain the virtues that were passed on from previous generations, but in the practical is also how to wash a dead body. Very important. That at a death time, there are several teenagers in that room who are being taught, look, this is how this is done. So with the intent that they'll pass it on to the next generation. So the mosque becomes the focal point of where the education begins with the home, and then actually the home is where it is actually germinated, and the mosque where it comes to fruition.
It's actually brought up a very good question, and it's near and dear to my heart because I'm actually the youth leader at our temple. And it's probably the number one reason why I started walking this path, because I felt that it was very important that we continued our culture and our heritage, but in a way that we can explain it to the next generation, because I really struggled when I was growing up trying to assimilate Eastern and Western values. And and trying to put it all, like you have so many jigsaw puzzle pieces in your head and just trying to make a picture out of that that really works. And I think that that's what we're finding is that historically in India, our parents' generation, when they were learning our religion and our culture, they were surrounded by it. So they just did as everybody else did. They didn't really understand the logic behind it. They just did it. But that doesn't resonate with youth in this country and in this day and age where they're so highly educated and they question, they want to know the logic behind what we do. Fortunately, we live in a day of, easy access to information. So you're finding a lot more resources for them to answer those questions, which weren't as prevalent 10, 15, 20 years ago. So that's making a difference in terms of helping our youth really understand why we do what we do. You're starting to find more American-born religious figures that help explain things as well. And more than anything, I think the number one thing when it comes to instructing youth in our culture and heritage is having positive role models. Having people who aren't necessarily explaining to them what to do, but living through their life and being an example of how, by implementing these principles, you can lead a more happy, peaceful life. And I think for youth in this country, what resonates most with them is when they can see a practical impact of religion in their lives. And if they can see in your life that you are becoming calmer, you're becoming more peaceful, you're becoming a better person, you're becoming more kind and compassionate and caring, and they can see that process, they can see that there is value to these things that we teach at the mosque and we teach at the temple. So I'm finding that resonates with the youth. I think, like, looking at my journey, I kind of went full circle where I was very secular and materialistic, and then I realized that wasn't leading to increased happiness, and then I came back this way. And I'm finding other youth that are doing the same thing, and we just kind of provide a place or a forum for them to come back to.
Thank you. Before Kevin reaches out with a long hook to pull us
No,
off,
I'm all right.
I think we're done, and I just want to thank both of our panelists.
And before I reach out with a long hook, I just want to acknowledge the three gentlemen who are up here are very important to the interfaith dialogue that's going on and has been going on for many years in the Lehigh Valley. So thank you, all three of you, for your partnership in that venue.